In 1692, Salem became a stage for one of the darkest reality shows in American history. No rules, no logic, just fear, frenzy, and finger-pointing. Today, for the first time, the accused, the accusers, and the judge get a turn in the confession room. Hi there, I'm Kelly, and this is Eerie Eats, where creepy stories and yummy recipes come together like cornbread and confessions. We have some of the main players in the Salem Witch Trials. They are here to tell us their side of what happened. I'm not going to be cooking today, but I will have a little something for our guests to snack on, and that is brown butter and molasses cornbread. Just like they would have made back then, minus the browned butter. So let's get into Salem Confessions. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 19 were hung, and 1 was crushed to death. We'll never truly know what they were thinking, because obviously none of them are still alive to tell us, but tonight we're going to imagine what they might have said if they were given the chance to speak freely, to confess, to justify, to blame. And it all begins with a girl pointing her finger. Abigail Williams.
Abigail, looking back, do you think that you knew what you were doing?
They wanted me to say I didn't know. That I was just a child, caught in a storm. I didn't understand. But I knew. Not everything, but enough. I knew when I screamed that people listened. And when I pointed, people vanished.
And you were one of the youngest accusers. What made you speak up?
I was 12, and surrounded by adults who kept whispering about the devil. They said Satan was in the village, that he could hide in anyone. And suddenly all eyes were on me, watching, waiting for a sign. So I gave them one. Because being believed felt like power. And when you're a girl in Salem, that's a miracle.
Reverend, how did all of this begin from your point of view?
It began in my own house. My daughter, Betty, and my niece Abigail suddenly stricken, screaming, contorting, speaking in tongues, and I did what any God-fearing man would do. I looked to the Lord for answers, but what I saw instead was the devil right in my own parlor.
What was life like in Salem Village back then, especially for someone like you?
Back then I lived in Rev Parris's home, my uncle. He never met a man more obsessed with sin. He could take the joy out of morning bread. We weren't allowed to laugh, or dance, or even breathe too loudly on the Sabbath. And if something went wrong, if a cow died or a child got sick, well, Satan was always to blame. It was winter, 1692. Salem Village was freezing and miserable. The fire barely warmed the bones. The sermons made your soul colder. The food was kind of scarce. Neighbors fought over land. People whispered behind closed doors and prayed loud enough to cover it. There was no lightness in life, especially not for little girls. We were seen and not heard.
Tituba, how did your name even get pulled into this?
Abigail said my name first. And once she did, there was no going back. She cried out and pointed at me, and the room shifted. The Reverend turned. The girls were screaming. The whole town sucked in a breath, and I became the devil's handmaid.
Do you remember your first accusation?
I remember my father's voice telling me who we couldn't trust. I remember the way the girls looked at each other when someone new was named. There was this thrill about it, like we were part of something holy, something terrifying and big. And when you cried out once, it was really easy to do it again. And it just got easier every time.
Sarah, why do you think you were one of the first to be accused?
Because I was poor. Because I was angry. Because I didn't smile at the right people. And in Salem, that was enough. I begged for scraps. I lived in doorways. I didn't have a husband to protect me or a good name to hide behind. So when they needed someone to blame, they pointed at me.
Some people say you were protecting your own name, your own family.
I was protecting the church, the people. Yes, my niece was involved, but I believe she was a victim, a vessel, and I had a duty to the congregation, to Puritan cause, to root out evil wherever it hid.
Mary, you were known as a kind, devout woman. Did you ever imagine you'd be accused of witchcraft?
Never. I was a mother, a wife, a neighbor who prayed with her hands in the soil. I kept to my duties, loved my family, and feared God. That was what I was supposed to do, and that was what was supposed to protect us. But in Salem, even goodness wasn't a shield. It became a target.
Miss Putnam, why do you think Salem turned against itself?
Because fear is easier than truth, and because revenge can wear a Sunday bonnet. We were a village of grief. I lost 7 children. 7! Each one gone before I could even speak their names aloud. And when something breaks you that deeply, you start looking for someone to blame.
Were you ever pressured to name someone?
Pressured? Yes. But not always with words.
What do you mean?
Sometimes it was a look, a nod. Sometimes it was knowing who your family owed money to or who owned land that your father wanted. People think the devil was whispering in Salem, but it wasn't the devil. It was debt, jealousy, grudges, all dressed up in piety.
By now, the web was tangled beyond repair. What started as whispers in a cold room had spiraled into full-blown hysteria. Friends turned on friends. Families were torn apart. And the trials, they weren't about witches anymore. They were about power. The kind that didn't come from truth, but from who could lie the loudest and survive the longest. At this point, it wasn't justice, it was theater. A full-blown production starring panic, pride, and people who suddenly forgot what common sense looked like.
Tituba, did you ever actually practice witchcraft or cast any spells with the girls?
The girls, Rev Parris and Abigail Williams, they used to come to me at night, whispering questions. And they didn't want Bible stories. They wanted secrets. They wanted to know who they'd marry, how to get what they wanted. So yes, I told them things. Folk magic, old traditions from Barbados. It was never meant to harm. It was never really witchcraft. But in Salem, even pretending was a crime.
Were you really possessed, or did you always know it was an act?
People say I was possessed and that I believed what I said. But that wasn't true. I knew exactly how to twitch, how to sob, and when to scream. It wasn't hard, really. People told us what they wanted, so we just gave it to them. And look, don't act like I did it alone. The courts could have stopped us. The ministers could have paused, but they didn't. They wanted witches, so I gave them witches.
Mary, what was your trial like?
A theatrical play. A pageant of lies and trembling girls. I watched them contort and gasp and scream at invisible specters. Mine, they claimed. I denied it, of course. I stood firm. But the judges had already decided my fate. They were only waiting for the right cue to pronounce it.
What did you say in your final petition?
I begged for mercy. Not for myself, but for the others. I said, if I must die, let it end with me. Let no more innocent blood be spilled. They nodded, they wept, and they hung me anyway.
Tituba, what made you confess? Was it fear or survival?
I didn't confess because I was guilty. I confessed because I was smart. They beat me. They starved me. They said I'd hang. But if I gave them names, if I gave them one story, suddenly I wasn't the monster. I was a witness, a tool, a survivor.
Do you believe the women you helped accuse were truly witches?
No, but it didn't matter. By the time the screaming started and the courts opened their doors, truth had already been buried deeper than any of my children. Once the fire was lit, didn't care who it burned.
Do you remember your last day?
I remember the rope. I remember praying for my baby. And I remember looking at Reverend Noyes, that smug grin on his face, and he asked me to confess that I was a witch, and I said, "You're a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." And years later, Noyes died, choking on his own blood. Poetic justice, if I do say so myself.
Reverend, did you ever question your role in what happened?
Every day. But doubt in those days was dangerous. If I paused, if I faltered, I risked everything, my pulpit, my family, my life. So I stood firm, and when the gallows rose, I kept preaching. Because what else could I do?
And you apologized years later. Why?
Because it haunted me. Because I saw their faces in my sleep. Because my own child died, and I wondered if it was punishment from God. So I stood in church in front of everyone and I said, I confess I was deluded by Satan. I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg for forgiveness. It was the only thing that I could do that didn't feel like a lie.
Last question, Abigail. You accused people who were innocent, people who died. Do you regret it?
Every day, I see Sarah Good's face, Tituba's broken spirit, Mary Eastey's prayer before the rope. I remember Ann Jr.'s silence beside me. We all played a part, but I was the lead, and no stage ever felt colder than the gallows that I built with my words.
Reverend, if you could say one thing to the people of Salem, what would it be?
Beware the fire that you light in God's name, because it does not only burn the wicked. Sometimes it consumes the ones that spark it.
In Salem, truth was what people feared most, and a lie spoken loud enough could unalive anyone. These confessions were never heard. until now, and obviously I can only speculate on the true beliefs and emotions of these people. We'll never know what was in the minds of Salem in 1692. Well, that kind of got a little dark, I think, but anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the subscribe button, the like button, do all the things, and if you have any creepy or dark stories that you'd like me to cover, or recipes that you'd like for me to try, then tell me down in the comments. But for now, see you later! Bye, spooky friends! And try the cornbread.